Thank you. The majority of my research has been looking at the ways in which French Algeria, so colonial Algeria, is remembered by the French people who left Algeria since the end of the war in 1962. And when I started out with my research, this was filled with a lot of nice autobiography about how beautiful the homeland was and wonderful representations of the sea and the sunshine and the glorious country that Algeria was that they left behind, and great fraternity between the peoples that lived in Algeria and the French. And as the narratives evolved, my research has had to follow that as well. For those of you who don't know much about the Algerian War, I'll just really briefly give you a little bit of context. The war for independence started in 1954. It ended in 1962. 7 years of brutal conflict. There were terrorist activities on both sides of the war. Many civilians were injured, wounded, killed throughout that time. Initially, after the war ended and into the late 1990s, the French did not want to talk about this, so this was sort of a silenced war. The trauma wasn't addressed. And as the older generation began to die out, people began to more directly grapple with this memory of violence and confusion. So what we have now is a series of people who were children during the time of the war. They can absolve themselves of any kind of physical guilt for committing acts during this time, and they're feeling more able to try to grapple with, through narrative, the ways that they suffered and the ways that the people around them suffered as well. So this is a lot of traumatic narrative. I've started to look at 4 specific cases from the war. These are 4 different women that survived different bombings that happened, 3 of them in Algeria, 1 of them in France during this period, who've all written autobiography. So the first is Nicole Gere. I've worked with her kind of extensively. She's an artist. She wrote her autobiography, Algérie 1962. I've got the translations up there as well. It was published in 2013. Our UQ students actually translated that, so you can read it in English online if you're interested in that. She survived a very famous bombing at the Milk Bar in Algiers on the 30th of September in 1956, and she was 10 years old. And she has since become an advocate for victims of terrorism. She continues actively in her artwork and also in her writing now to talk about that event. And the woman sitting, or the young girl sitting next to her there, has also published an autobiography. That's Danielle Michel Chiche. She wrote Lettre à Zoradé, Letter to Zora Drif, and she published it in 2012. So she was a victim of the same event. These 2 women have kind of gone to war with each other because of their memories and the ways that their memories conflict, and the ways that they believe that the memory should be addressed, and the way that terrorism should be addressed, and whether they should be considered survivors or victims, or how they should talk about the ways in which they remember. Michel Chiche has also been a successful author. She's published many books, and she was a journalist as well. More recently, in 2015, we have Nicole Simone, who published La Bombe, Mastaganem, j'avais 15 ans. She was 15 years old. She went to a concert in Algeria. Through a series of twists of fate, she was seated on top of the bomb that exploded that day, and she survived because she was seated on top of the bomb. She explains in quite detail what happened that day. She did not want to talk about her experience. She experienced a lot of post-traumatic stress syndrome, a lot of events throughout her life that plagued her, but because of recent terrorist events, she decided that she needed to write something more publicly about what she experienced. And finally, we have Delphine Fanaa, who was 4 years old when there was a bomb of her apartment in Paris. She was playing in the bedroom where the bomb was thrown. The intended target was André Malraux, who was the Minister of Culture at that time in Paris. He was not at the house, so he was not hurt, but this was a bomb that was thrown by people who wanted to keep Algeria French. They were French people that were bombing other French people at that time. So her experience is slightly different. Each of the women were wounded in very visible and violent ways. Nicole Gere was amputated of her left arm. Danielle Michel Chiche lost her right leg. Nicole Simone was burned over a large percentage of her body, and she tried very consistently to hide her wounds. And Delphine Fanaa is blind. She lost sight in one eye when she was little, and later on lost sight in her other eye. All 4 of them have had great careers. So Nicole Simone was a doctor, or is still a doctor and an author, and Delphine Fanaa is a psychiatrist. So they've all gone about their lives. They've all done successful things. But they've all very recently, since 2012, decided to write about these events. And so I'm trying to look at the things that are in common and the reasons why they're writing about that today. Each of these bombings was heavily mediatized, and each of these women had their pictures throughout France and Algeria at the time. And I found out recently, actually, that the photo of Delphina Fanaa appears in an artwork by Nicole Gere, and I'm not sure that Nicole actually realizes that it's a picture of Delphina Fanaa. So there's a lot of intersections between the books and their accounts. And I just wanted to talk very briefly about what they had in common and then what we can do with this. So each of these women has to grapple with a sense of guilt, even though they are survivors and we can consider them as innocent because of the physical wounds that they bore on their bodies. People approach them and let them know very vocally about what they think about them surviving these events. It's been quite difficult for them to navigate that. Each one also went through different periods of trying to hide their wounds and trying to act normal and trying to make everyone around them feel very comfortable. When I was with Nicole Gere, we had people staring at her while we were talking about the war, and she very clearly told me, I'm the one that's bothering them. They're really upset that I'm here. She wears her prosthetic arm so that people feel more comfortable, even though she feels very uncomfortable. Danielle Michel-Chiche talks about trying to walk as normally as possible and her mother being extremely proud of her, being able to hide her limp when she walks with her prosthetics. So we have that sort of thing that's happening in their text. But more recently, what's been interesting to me are the sense of aftershocks that appear. Later in life, Michel-Chiche fell in her garden and she had to learn how to walk all over again. So she thought she had overcome this sort of disability that she had, and then she was re-injured. They also found a shard of glass in her eye that they didn't know had been there since the time of the bombing when she was a child, and that was just recently discovered, and it's affected her vision. So we have that reminder, the physical reminders that reappear, and also politically. So each time there is a new terrorist event in France, each of these women comes back to the media and is asked to comment on what's happening today in France, and each one bears a social responsibility to try to figure out how terrorism should be addressed and how survivors of terrorism should be able to talk about their stories. So what I'm coming to is that writing and art are able to make survivors out of victims. They're able to tell their stories, to grapple with the past. It bears witness to the trauma that they experienced. It creates spaces of remembrance, especially for those who cannot return to the places where things happened to them. They cannot go back home, so to speak, but they can do so in their writing, and they can grapple with all of the trauma and pain that they had to endure through the writing space. And through us being able to read this, we become witnesses to these events, and we're able to acknowledge the pain and suffering and provide a sort of healing for these people. And so that's where I'm going with my research. In the next part, I will be looking at the 2015 terrorist attacks. We have a huge corpus of autobiography that's already appearing about that, and so I'll be looking at how this continues on today. So, thank you.